The summer breeze carried the sound of laughter through the backyard as two women sat on the patio, sharing iced tea and memories. Grace and Lily had been best friends for 15 years, since their college days when they'd bonded over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of success. Now in their mid-30s, they seemed to have it all figured out. Lily lived in a beautiful two-story house with a white picket fence and flower beds bursting with colorful blooms, the kind of home that belonged in magazines. Her husband Tom was a successful architect who designed their dream home himself, and their teenage son Kevin was a bright student who made them proud every day. From the outside looking in, Lily's life was picture perfect. Grace, on the other hand, lived alone in a modern apartment downtown. She'd built a successful career as a chemical engineer, earning respect in her field and living what appeared to be a fulfilling single life. But appearances can be deceiving, and behind her warm smile and designer outfits, Grace harbored thoughts that would have shocked anyone who knew her. Every Sunday afternoon, Grace would arrive at Lily's house with freshly baked cookies or a new recipe to try. She'd help Kevin with his science homework, discuss architectural trends with Tom, and spend hours chatting with Lily about everything and nothing. She was more than a friend, she was family. "What would we do without you?" Lily would often say, pulling Grace into a tight hug. The family photos on Lily's walls told stories of countless shared moments: birthday parties, Christmas celebrations, summer barbecues. In every picture, Grace was there, standing slightly to the side, her eyes holding a look that no one had ever noticed. She'd watched Tom teach Kevin how to ride a bike, helped Lily plan anniversary surprises, and organize their family vacations. She knew their favorite foods, their daily routines, their little quirks and habits. "You should find someone special too," Lily would tell her friend, genuine concern in her voice. "You deserve to be as happy as Tom and I are." Grace would just smile and change the subject, but inside, her heart would race. If only Lily knew that Grace had already found what she wanted, it just happened to belong to her best friend. At dinner parties, Grace was the perfect guest, charming everyone with her wit and intelligence. She'd help in the kitchen, play board games with Kevin, and engage in deep conversations with Tom about his latest projects. The neighbors often commented on what a wonderful friend she was, always there when the family needed her. But beneath the surface of that perfect friendship, something darker was growing. When Grace looked at family photos on Lily's walls, she didn't see her best friend's happy moments. She saw the life she believed should have been hers. Each time Lily showed off a new gift from Tom or shared stories about their romantic getaways, Grace's smile would tighten just slightly. In her quiet moments alone, Grace would sit in her apartment, surrounded by magazines featuring Tom's architectural designs. She'd trace his name with her finger, imagining a different life, one where she was the one living in the beautiful house, married to Tom, being Kevin's mother. These thoughts had started as fleeting fantasies, but had grown into something more intense, more real. The local community saw them as friendship goals, the successful businesswoman and the devoted housewife, supporting each other through life's ups and downs. They volunteered together at the local food bank, attended charity galas side by side, and were always there to help other families in need. No one suspected that behind Grace's caring facade lay a heart filled with envy and desire. As another Sunday afternoon drew to a close, Grace hugged Lily goodbye, promising to bring her special tea blend next time, the same tea they'd been sharing for months now. Lily had been complaining about feeling tired lately, but she brushed it off as stress from her busy life. Grace nodded sympathetically, already planning her next visit, her mind working on the next step of a plan that had been forming for years. Walking to her car, Grace looked back at the house, at the warm light spilling from the windows, at Kevin's bicycle leaning against the garage, at Tom's silhouette visible in his home office. Soon, she thought, soon everything would change. But for now, she was just the perfect friend, the reliable Grace, the one person this family could always count on. Little did they know that their world was about to turn upside down, all because of a friendship that seemed too good to be true. The changes were so subtle at first that no one noticed. Lily would forget where she put her car keys, or she'd pause mid-sentence, losing her train of thought. "I'm just tired." She'd laugh it off, running her successful pharmaceutical company keeping her busier than ever. But Grace noticed everything, watching with careful eyes as her plans slowly unfolded. It started during their Sunday tea sessions. Grace would bring her special blend, claiming it had calming properties to help with stress. "It's all natural," she'd assure Lily, dropping honey into the steaming cup. What Lily didn't know was that Grace spent hours in her home laboratory carefully measuring and mixing substances that would leave no trace. The symptoms grew gradually over weeks. Lily began having trouble concentrating during board meetings. She'd called Grace in tears, confused about why she couldn't remember important client names. "Maybe you're working too hard," Grace would say soothingly, offering to help organize Lily's schedule. Each time Lily showed another symptom, Grace was there, the perfect friend, taking notes to share with the doctors. Tom started noticing changes too. His wife would get dizzy spells at dinner, or she'd put salt in her coffee instead of sugar. He suggested seeing specialists, accompanying Lily to countless appointments. Grace went too, sitting in waiting rooms, holding Lily's hand, memorizing every detail the doctors shared. "What would we do without you?" Tom would say, grateful for her unwavering support. Young Kevin noticed his mother wasn't quite herself anymore. She'd forget to pick him up from soccer practice or put empty plates in the oven instead of the dishwasher. Grace stepped in, offering to help with Kevin's schedule, becoming an even more constant presence in their lives. "Your mom just needs rest," she'd tell him, making his favorite sandwich exactly the way Lily used to. The local community rallied around them. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered help, but Grace politely managed it all. "Lily needs consistency right now," she'd explain, keeping others at a careful distance. She organized meal schedules, supervised the housekeeping, and slowly became indispensable to the family's daily routine. At work, Lily's condition became impossible to hide. During a crucial presentation, she completely blanked out, staring at familiar faces as if they were strangers. Her assistant called Grace immediately, who arrived within minutes, professional and composed. "She's been under tremendous stress," Grace explained to the concerned board members, helping Lily gather her things. The doctors were baffled. Test after test came back inconclusive. They suggested everything from stress to early onset conditions, but nothing quite fit the pattern of symptoms. Grace attended every appointment, her background in chemical engineering allowing her to ask detailed, intelligent questions that impressed the medical team. "You understand these things better than I do," Lily would say weakly, squeezing her friend's hand. Tom started relying on Grace more and more. She knew Lily's schedule, medication times, and every detail of her deteriorating condition. Late one night, after Lily had finally fallen asleep, Tom broke down in the kitchen. "I don't know what's happening to her," he confessed, his voice cracking. Grace placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her heart racing at the contact. Kevin watched his mother's decline with growing fear. He'd overhear conversations between his father and Grace, catch glimpses of worried looks, and notice how his mother seemed to fade a little more each day. Grace was always there, making everything run smoothly, becoming the stable force in their increasingly chaotic lives. The weekend charity gala was approaching, an event Lily had organized for years. Despite her condition, she insisted on attending. "It means so much to her," Grace told Tom, helping him pick out Lily's dress. She knew this would be the last event they'd attend together, but no one else suspected what was coming. As autumn leaves began to fall, Grace looked at her reflection in her apartment window. Soon, everything would change. She touched the small vial in her pocket, the final dose that would bring her carefully crafted plan to its conclusion. Tomorrow was another Sunday tea session, and Grace had prepared something special for her dearest friend. After all, isn't that what best friends are for? The charity gala was in full swing at the Grand Plaza Hotel, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd. Lily stood near the entrance, greeting guests with her usual grace, though those who knew her well could see she wasn't quite herself. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her champagne glass, and her smile seemed strained. Grace stayed close by, watching carefully as Lily navigated through the evening. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented Lily's pale pink gown, always the supportive best friend. Tom was across the room, discussing a new building project with potential clients, occasionally glancing over at his wife with concern. "I just need some air," Lily whispered to Grace, pressing a hand to her forehead. They made their way to the balcony, the cool evening breeze offering little relief. Grace held her friend's arm, noting how fragile she felt. "Everything's spinning," Lily murmured, her words becoming slurred. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Lily's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into Grace's waiting arms. The commotion drew immediate attention. "Call an ambulance." Grace's voice rang out, steady and controlled despite the chaos. Tom rushed over, cradling his wife's head, while Grace checked her pulse with practiced movements. The next few hours in the hospital waiting room felt endless. Kevin arrived, still in his soccer uniform, his young face pale with worry. Grace took charge, speaking with doctors, handling paperwork, and keeping everyone calm. She knew exactly what to tell the medical team, describing Lily's symptoms with precise detail that came from months of careful observation. When the doctor finally emerged with the news, Grace was holding Tom's hand. The words "passed away" echoed through the sterile hallway. The cause? A rare autoimmune condition, they said, likely developing over months. Tom broke down, and Grace caught him, her shoulder becoming wet with his tears. Kevin stood frozen, looking younger than his 15 years. The following days passed in a blur of black clothes and hushed conversations. Grace organized everything: the funeral arrangements, the flowers, the catering for the wake. She knew all of Lily's preferences, down to the music she would have wanted played. The community praised her dedication, amazed at how she held everything together while dealing with her own grief. At the funeral, Grace gave a moving eulogy that brought tears to every eye. She spoke of 15 years of friendship, of shared dreams and endless support. Her voice cracked at just the right moments, her grief appearing so genuine that no one questioned the glint in her eyes. Tom sat in the front row, clutching Kevin's hand, both lost in their own pain. The house felt empty in the days that followed. Grace came by daily, making sure meals were eaten, laundry was done, and life somehow continued. She'd sit with Kevin, looking through old photo albums, sharing stories about his mother. "She was my best friend," Grace would say, wiping away tears that seemed real enough. Tom threw himself into work, spending long hours at his office, unable to face the emptiness of his home. Grace would wait up with dinner ready, offering comfort and understanding. She knew exactly when to speak and when to simply sit in silence, her presence becoming a source of stability in their shattered world. Kevin struggled to adjust to life without his mother. His grades started slipping, and he spent more time alone in his room. Grace was there too, helping with homework, making his favorite snacks, slowly filling the void Lily left behind. "Your mom would be so proud of how strong you're being," she'd tell him, carefully watching his reactions. As weeks turned into months, Grace became an essential part of their healing process. She organized Lily's clothes for donation, carefully preserving special pieces that held memories. She helped Tom sort through paperwork, handle insurance claims, and manage the daily tasks that seemed overwhelming. The investigation into Lily's death was brief and conclusive. The doctors found nothing suspicious, just a tragic case of an undetected condition that took a life too soon. Grace had been thorough, leaving no trace of her carefully executed plan. She attended every meeting with medical examiners, had chemical engineering background, helping her understand and explain away any questions that arose. As autumn turned to winter, Grace stood in Lily's kitchen, soon to be her kitchen, watching Tom and Kevin attempt to decorate for the holidays. They were healing, slowly but surely, and she was there every step of the way. Her plan had worked perfectly, but this was just the beginning. Phase 1 was complete, and now it was time to move forward with the next part of her carefully crafted future. 6 months after Lily's passing, the seasons had changed twice, but grief still hung heavy in the air of the family home. The winter snow had melted into spring flowers, yet Tom still reached for 2 coffee cups each morning out of habit. Grace noticed these little moments, filing them away, waiting for the perfect time to make her move. She'd been careful, so careful in those first months, playing the role of the grieving best friend while slowly becoming indispensable to both father and son. She knew exactly how to time her visits, not too eager, but always available when needed. The casseroles she brought over, the quiet evenings spent helping Kevin with homework, the gentle way she'd listened to Tom talk about his memories, everything was calculated, yet appeared completely natural. The moment she'd been waiting for came on a quiet Sunday evening. Tom was going through old photos in the living room, a glass of wine in hand. Grace sat nearby, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to seem respectful. "I miss her laugh," Tom said softly, his voice cracking. Without thinking, he reached for Grace's hand. Time seemed to stop in that moment. Grace let the silence stretch, perfectly aware of how her hand felt in his. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I miss her too." Their eyes met, and she saw the loneliness reflected in his gaze. She started to pull away, playing the part of the conflicted friend, but Tom held on. The kiss that followed was brief, gentle, almost innocent. Grace pulled back first, her eyes wide with perfectly practiced surprise. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, standing up quickly. "I should go." She grabbed her purse, knowing Tom would stop her before she reached the door. He did. "Please stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Grace turned slowly, tears glistening in her eyes, tears she'd learned to summon at will. "We shouldn't," she whispered, while her heart raced with triumph. "Lily was my best friend." Over the next few weeks, Grace orchestrated a delicate dance of guilt and attraction. She'd avoid Tom's calls, then show up with dinner because she was worried about them eating properly. She'd keep her distance at family gatherings, but their eyes would meet across the room, holding secrets. The community began to whisper, but Grace knew exactly how to handle the gossip. "I never meant for this to happen," she'd tell her neighbors, her voice trembling with emotion. "Lily was everything to me." But seeing them struggle alone, she'd leave sentences unfinished, letting others fill in the blanks. The narrative began to shift, from scandal to sweet, from inappropriate to meant to be. Kevin noticed the change in dynamics, watching with teenage uncertainty as Grace's role in their lives shifted. She was extra careful with him, never trying to replace his mother, but always there with understanding and support. "Your mom would want your dad to be happy," she'd say gently, when she caught him looking confused or upset. The first time they went out as a couple, Grace chose a restaurant in the next town over. Out of respect, she explained to Tom. She wore a modest dress, ordered Lily's favorite wine, and spoke about her cherished memories of her friend. By the end of the evening, Tom was holding her hand openly, his wedding ring catching the candlelight. Their relationship progressed at exactly the pace Grace had planned. She was patient, understanding, never pushing too hard. When Tom suggested they keep things quiet for Kevin's sake, she agreed immediately. When he wanted to wait before telling their friends, she supported his decision. Every step was a careful calculation, though it appeared completely natural to everyone watching. The neighbors slowly came around, seeing how Grace helped maintain Lily's beloved garden, how she kept family traditions alive, how she seemed to put Tom and Kevin's needs before her own. "She's been such a blessing," they'd say, forgetting their initial shock at the relationship. Who better to help them heal? As spring turned to summer, Grace began leaving small items at the house, a toothbrush, a sweater, her favorite coffee mug. Each object was a tiny claim to territory, a small step toward her ultimate goal. Tom never seemed to notice the gradual transformation, how his house was slowly becoming her space too. One evening, as they sat on the patio where she and Lily used to share tea, Tom turned to Grace with tears in his eyes. "I feel guilty," he confessed, "about being happy again." Grace took his hand, her touch comforting and familiar now. "Lily would want this," she said softly, the lie coming easily after so much practice. "She would want us all to be happy." Inside, Kevin watched them through his bedroom window, clutching an old photo of his mother. Something about Grace's smile in the fading light made him uneasy, but he couldn't explain why. She was perfect, too perfect perhaps, but that thought was still taking shape in his young mind, like a shadow glimpsed from the corner of one's eye. The wedding was small and tasteful, held in the garden where Grace and Lily once shared their afternoon teas. 1 year had passed since Lily's death, and now Grace stood in the same spot, saying "I do" to Tom. She wore an elegant cream-colored dress, not white, she'd insisted, out of respect for Lily's memory. A single-framed photo of Lily sat on a table nearby, a frozen smile watching over the ceremony. Kevin stood as his father's best man, his teenage frame uncomfortable in the new suit. He'd given a short speech, his words carefully chosen, speaking about new beginnings, while his eyes held questions he couldn't yet voice. Grace had hugged him afterward, whispering how proud his mother would be, but Kevin had stiffened at her touch. The changes began slowly after the honeymoon. First, it was small things. Grace rearranging the kitchen cupboards to her liking, replacing the old curtains with modern blinds. Then came bigger changes. Lily's favorite armchair disappeared one day, replaced by a sleek new one that Grace said opened up the room better. Family photos were rearranged, with Grace and Tom's wedding photo taking center stage. Only Lily's portrait in the living room remained untouched, but even that felt different now. Grace would often dust it with exaggerated care, speaking softly about her dear friend whenever visitors came by. "I try to keep her memory alive," she'd say, her voice thick with emotion that Kevin was starting to doubt. At 16, Kevin spent more time in his room, surrounded by memories of his mother that he feared might disappear like her armchair. He'd saved some of her things, her old diary, her favorite scarf, photos she'd kept in her bedside drawer. Late at night, he'd read through her old journals, trying to understand who his mother really was. One entry caught his attention. "Feeling strange again today. Grace brought her special tea, but something feels off. Must be working too hard." Kevin remembered those days, how his mother would seem confused, how Grace was always there with her special tea and comforting words. He began to notice patterns in his mother's writing, periods of clarity followed by confusion, always after Grace's visits. The house felt different now, filled with Grace's presence. Her perfume lingered in every room, a magazine scattered on coffee tables, her health foods filling the pantry. Tom seemed happy enough, relieved to have someone managing their lives again, but Kevin saw how Grace watched his father, how her eyes followed his every move. One afternoon, while looking for an old school report, Kevin found a box of his mother's work papers in the attic. Inside were emails she printed, notes about strange discrepancies in lab results, concerns about unauthorized access to certain chemicals. The dates aligned perfectly with when she'd started feeling ill. Kevin's hands shook as he read, pieces of a puzzle slowly fitting together. Grace caught him coming down from the attic, dust on his clothes. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp. Kevin lied smoothly about searching for old video games, but something in Grace's gaze told him she didn't believe him. That night, he heard her in the attic moving boxes around. The next day, Kevin skipped soccer practice to visit his mother's old office. Her former assistant greeted him warmly, happy to share memories of Lily. As they talked, Kevin carefully asked about his mother's last months at work. The assistant's face changed, mentioning how strange it was that such an experienced scientist would suddenly make basic mistakes, how she'd seemed increasingly confused. At home, Kevin started noticing more things. How Grace always wore one of his mother's old necklaces, how she'd taken over Lily's garden club presidency, how she befriended all of Lily's close friends. It was as if she was slowly erasing his mother and replacing her with herself, piece by piece. Tom remained blind to it all, caught up in his work and his new marriage. "Grace has been such a blessing," he'd say whenever Kevin tried to raise concerns. "She's helped us heal." But Kevin saw no healing, only replacement, calculated and careful, like a slow-acting poison. One evening, Kevin found his mother's old phone in a box marked for donation. The battery was dead, but he charged it in secret. Hours later, hidden under his blankets, he scrolled through old messages. There it was, messages between his mother and her lab partner, discussing concerns about missing chemicals, about security breaches that coincided with Grace's visits to the facility. Grace stood in the doorway of Kevin's room that night, watching him sleep, or pretend to sleep. She'd seen the light under his door, heard the rustle of papers. Her perfect plan was facing its first real threat, and it came from a teenager who still wore superhero pajamas. As she closed his door, her mind was already working on a solution. After all, she hadn't come this far to let anyone, even her new stepson, ruin everything she'd worked for. The confrontation happened on a quiet Sunday evening, exactly 2 years after Lily's first symptoms began. Kevin stood in the kitchen, his mother's old phone and journal spread out on the counter, while Grace prepared her signature tea. His heart pounded as he watched her familiar routine with new eyes. "I know what you did," he said quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. Grace's hands paused for just a moment as she poured the hot water, but her face remained calm. "What do you mean, sweetie?" she asked, that same honey-sweet tone he'd grown to distrust. Kevin pushed his mother's phone across the counter. "Mom was investigating missing chemicals at her lab," he said. "Chemicals that disappeared during your visits." Grace's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. She set down the teapot carefully, every movement controlled. "You've been going through old things again," she said softly. "It's not healthy to dwell on the past." But Kevin wasn't finished. He opened the journal to a marked page. "She wrote about feeling strange after your tea sessions, every time. And look at the dates, they match perfectly with her worst symptoms." His voice cracked slightly. "You poisoned her, didn't you? You killed my mom." Grace's reaction was not what he expected. Instead of denying it, she sat down across from him, her face filled with concern. "Tom," she called out, "could you come here? We need to talk about Kevin." Her voice carried a worried note that made Kevin's stomach twist. Tom rushed in, seeing his son's angry face and his wife's concerned expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, looking between them. Grace reached for his hand, her eyes filling with perfectly timed tears. "I'm worried about Kevin," she said softly. "He's been making up terrible stories. I think he needs help." What followed was like a nightmare. Grace spoke about finding Kevin in the attic late at night, about his obsession with his mother's death, about his paranoid accusations. She mentioned his dropping grades, his withdrawal from friends, his unhealthy fixation on the past. Every word was carefully chosen to paint a picture of a troubled teenager unable to cope with grief. "Dad, no." Kevin protested, but Grace's groundwork had been laid months ago. She'd already spoken to Tom about her concerns for Kevin's mental health, about grief sometimes manifesting as paranoia in teenagers. She'd left psychology articles where Tom would find them, prepared him for this moment. "Show your father what you found," Grace suggested gently, knowing how it would sound. Kevin's evidence, gathered in secret, looked like the work of an obsessed mind. His explanations about chemicals and tea sessions seemed far-fetched compared to Grace's simple concern for his well-being. Tom ran his hands through his hair, looking lost. Maybe we should talk to someone," he suggested carefully. "A professional." Kevin felt the walls closing in. Grace had played her hand perfectly, using his own investigation against him. Even his father couldn't see through her act. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Grace arranged appointments with a counselor who nodded sympathetically while Kevin tried to explain his suspicions. She found a wonderful boarding school that specialized in helping troubled teens process grief. Every step she took appeared loving and concerned to the outside world. Kevin overheard her on the phone late one night, talking about the school. "It's the best thing for him," she was saying. "He needs time away to heal." But he heard the satisfaction in her voice, the subtle tone of victory. She was getting rid of him, just as she'd gotten rid of his mother. In desperation, Kevin tried one last time to reach his father. He showed him the evidence he'd gathered, the timeline he'd created, but Tom only saw a son lost in grief, creating conspiracies to explain his pain. Grace stood nearby, her face a perfect mask of sympathy, as she watched her stepson's credibility crumble. The day Kevin left for boarding school, Grace hugged him tightly in front of everyone. "This is for your own good," she whispered, and only he could hear the warning in her voice. Tom promised to visit soon, believing he was doing the right thing for his troubled son. As the car pulled away, Kevin watched Grace wave goodbye, standing in front of what was once his mother's house, wearing his mother's favorite necklace. But what Grace didn't know was that Kevin had made copies of everything: the journal entries, the phone messages, the lab reports. Before leaving, he'd mailed them to his mother's old lab partner with a letter explaining his suspicions. He wasn't giving up, he was just changing tactics. In his new schoolroom, Kevin pinned up a photo of his mother. "I'll find the truth," he promised her silently, "no matter how long it takes." Meanwhile, back at the house, Grace stood in Lily's garden, finally alone, believing she'd won. But she didn't realize that her perfect crime had one flaw. She'd underestimated a teenager's love for his mother. 2 years had transformed Kevin from a confused teenager into a determined young man. His dorm room walls were covered with photos, documents, and sticky notes, a detective's board that told the story of his mother's final months. While Grace thought she'd silenced him, she'd actually given him the space and time he needed to build his case. Working with his mother's former lab partner, Dr. Chen, Kevin had slowly gathered evidence. Every weekend visit home became an opportunity to collect more pieces of the puzzle. He photographed Grace's home laboratory, documented the special tea blends she still kept, and carefully noted every inconsistency in her stories. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young intern who'd worked at Lily's company during her final months found old security footage. The grainy videos showed Grace accessing the chemical storage room using Lily's keycard on days when Lily had been homesick. Dr. Chen confirmed these dates matched perfectly with the missing inventory reports. Back at home, Grace had grown confident in her victory. She'd redecorated the entire house, leaving only Lily's portrait as a shrine to her dear friend. Tom had fully embraced their new life, his memories of Lily carefully managed by Grace's constant reminiscing about their wonderful friendship. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 years after Lily's death, Kevin came home for what seemed like a routine visit. Grace had prepared a special breakfast, wearing Lily's pearl necklace, her favorite trophy. She didn't notice the determined look in Kevin's eyes or the plain envelope he carried. "I brought something to show you and Dad," Kevin said calmly over breakfast. Grace's smile remained perfect as Tom sat down to look at what he assumed were school papers. But as Kevin spread out the documents, security photos, and lab reports, her composure began to crack. "What is this?" Tom asked, his coffee growing cold as he read report after report. Kevin explained everything: the missing chemicals, the security footage, the lab partner's testimony. He showed them his mother's journal entries, now annotated with technical analysis of her symptoms, matching the effects of the stolen compounds. Grace tried to maintain control. "This is ridiculous," she started, but her voice faltered as Kevin played a recording, her own voice from that night 2 years ago, talking about getting rid of him. She hadn't known about the small recorder he'd hidden before leaving for school. Tom's face grew pale as he read Lily's final notes about feeling strange after Grace's visits. The timeline Kevin had created showed everything: how Grace had slowly poisoned his wife, how she'd manipulated everyone during Lily's illness, how she'd orchestrated their relationship after Lily's death. "You were my best friend," Grace suddenly screamed, her calm facade shattering completely. "She had everything I deserved. The perfect house, the perfect family, the perfect life." Her hands shook as she grabbed Lily's portrait from the wall. "I was always there, always watching, always waiting." The police arrived quietly. Kevin had called them before starting breakfast. They found Grace clutching Lily's portrait, confessing everything in her rage. Tom stood frozen, watching as the woman he'd married revealed her true self. In her anger, she admitted things even Kevin hadn't discovered, providing the final pieces of evidence needed for arrest. As Grace was led away, still wearing Lily's necklace, Kevin hugged his father. Both men were crying, for Lily, for lost time, for the truth that had finally come to light. Dr. Chen arrived shortly after, bringing even more evidence that would ensure Grace faced justice for her crimes. The story made headlines: "Best Friend's Betrayal," a 3-year plot uncovered. The community was shocked, but Kevin received support from unexpected places. Lily's old garden club members brought food and comfort. His mother's former colleagues shared stories about her brilliance and kindness. Even his teachers from the boarding school sent letters praising his determination to uncover the truth. In the following months, Tom and Kevin began to heal, really heal this time, without Grace's manipulative influence. They sorted through Lily's belongings that Grace had hidden away, rediscovering memories that had been buried. The house slowly returned to feeling like their home again. One quiet evening, as they sat in the garden Lily had loved, Tom looked at his son with pride. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said softly. "You never gave up." Kevin smiled, touching the journal his mother had left behind, the first clue that had started his investigation. "She taught me to always look for the truth," he replied. The portrait of Lily now hung in a special place in their home, but it was different now. It wasn't a shrine to Grace's friendship, but a reminder of a beloved wife and mother whose story had finally been told. The truth had won out, justice had been served, and love, real love, had proven stronger than any perfectly planned deception. The end was indeed justice, but it was more than that. It was a son's devotion to his mother's memory, a family's journey back to truth, and a reminder that no matter how perfect a crime might seem, the truth has a way of coming to light.